Herzlich willkommen zum Donnerstagabend im Museum. Unsere Veranstaltung heute wird als Teil des Rahmenprogramms der Ausstellung Arcimboldo Bassano e Breuil, die Zeiten der Natur angeboten. Ich begrüße unseren Gast, Sabrina Minuzzi. Sie ist Buchhistorikerin und Forscherin auf dem Gebiet der Sozialgeschichte der Medizin. Sie ist Professorin für Bibliothekswesen und Bibliographie an der Universität Udine. Zu ihren wichtigsten Publikationen zählen Il secolo di carta, eine Studie über den venezianischen Buchdrucker Antonio Bosio, sowie Sul filo dei segreti, ein Werk über pharmazeutische Rezepte und therapeutische Praktiken im frühneuzeitlichen Venedig. Im Jahr 2023 schloss sie ein 3-jähriges Forschungsprojekt ab, das sie zwischen der Brown University of Providence und der Universität Ca' Foscari durchführte. Das Projekt befasste sich mit der Verbreitung pflanzenkundlichen Wissens in Italien im 15. und 16. Jahrhundert. Sie ist Mitglied des wissenschaftlichen Beirats der Ausstellung Arcimboldo Bassano e Breuil, die Zeiten der Natur gewesen und hat gemeinsam mit Mario Infelice einen Essay zur Entwicklung des agronomischen Wissens im 16. Jahrhundert für den Ausstellungskatalog verfasst. Exploring Nature with Passion and Curiosity in Early Modern Times ist der Titel ihres Vortrags, der eine vertiefte Auseinandersetzung mit Themen bietet, die in unserer Ausstellung angerissen werden. Wir werden in die Welt der Materia Medica der Renaissance entführt, die Welt der frühen Wissenschaft zwischen Pflanzen, Büchern und Heilpraktiken. I now give the floor to our guest, Sabrina Minuzzi.
First of all, I want just to thank a lot Francesca Del Torre and her wonderful team, Alexandra Sadler, Kirsten Pelling, and many others. I would like to share with you something that I hope might help frame some aspects of the exhibition in context. My talk is divided into 2 parts. I will begin with a brief overview of the agronomic literature, followed by a more in-depth look at works concerning materia medica, which shares with the former a focus on nature, though pursued with very different aims. Early modern agronomic literature shares several features with the medieval Taquina Sanitatis, as you have seen maybe in the exhibition. These works, in the concise format of Taquim, illustrated tables accompanied by brief captions, offered elite patrons some of the earliest visual representation of rural labor, food and drink, the fruits of human effort, shaped by celestial influence and seasonal rhythms. The Taquina Sanitatis stand as the visual counterpart to themes central to agronomic writing, which codified the systematic management of the 3 natural kingdoms, the cultivation of land, the rearing of animals, and activities such as fishing, hunting, and so on. Between the late 15th and the early 16th centuries, the growing interest in urban elites in land investment led to significant transformations in the agricultural landscape of northern Italy. Across the Veneto and Lombardy regions, hundreds of villas and country residences began to shape the rural environment. Notably, these developments often occurred in areas that just 2 centuries earlier had been centers for the production and circulations of the Taquina Sanitatis. In the wake of print, one of the earliest agronomic publications was the Scriptores Rei Rustice, a compilation of classical texts assembled by the humanist Giorgio Merola. The project was commissioned by Nicolas Janson, French printer, publisher, and bookseller active in Venice during the second half of the 15th century. He, Nicolas Janson, was the first to launch what would become a highly successful title, like Scriptores Rei Rustice. This edition, by the way, is among the most representative witnesses to the transition from manuscript to print. The volume left the printer's workshop without illustrations, though with generous margins and spaces reserved for later illumination, while many copies of the Scriptores Rei Rustice remained undecorated. This particular one was richly embellished by the miniaturist known as the Pico Master, who is quite a famous miniaturist. 19 illuminated and historiated initials punctuate the text with agronomic subjects. Here we see beekeeping, goat making, a woman adorned with flowers, barley harvesting, the grape harvest from married vines, trained to climb upright trees, and the slaughter of a pig in December. This is a medieval author who gained a great editorial success, publishing success during Renaissance. Crescenzi's Ruralia Commoda was based primarily on direct observation of agricultural practices in northern Italy during the late Middle Ages. Conceived as a practical encyclopedia, it was intended to equip members of the urban classes, often not of aristocratic background, who were beginning to acquire substantial estates in the countryside. The title had an extraordinary publishing success and served as a model for many later agronomic texts. It was translated into Italian, French, and German, and published in several major European cities. Leonardo da Vinci is known to have owned one of its early editions. The text is organized in 12 books covering topics such as the location and design of rural buildings, crop cultivation, fieldwork and agricultural produce, viticulture and winemaking, arboriculture and the properties of trees, of herbs, meadows, woods, gardens, animal husbandry, hunting and fishing. So many subjects, many agricultural subjects. The final book takes the form of a calendar revisiting these themes month by month in line with the seasonal rhythm of agricultural tasks. Some of the earliest Renaissance texts on agronomy included descriptions of plants grown for food, both for people and for animals, though not always with illustrations. The link with botanical publishing is clear in this example, where also the same woodcut blocks were reused in Mattioli Dioscorides, which was an herbal, a true materia medica text, as we will see, and in two other best-selling works, one by Herrera, the Spanish Herrera, and the other one by the Italian Francesco Sansovino. But in later agronomic literature, illustrations became increasingly rare, while the content grew more and more specialized. You see the same woodcut blocks. A good example of this growing specialization is Marco Bussato's Garden of Agriculture, that you can see in the exhibition. published in 1592. It focuses on crafting techniques for trees and vines, illustrated by 15 practical woodcuts. The idea of the garden, by the way, was central to Renaissance agriculture, and this focus on fruit cultivation fitted perfectly with the concept of the garden as a source of pleasure and well-being. The book concludes with 12 final avvertenze, one for each month, summarizing the tasks previously described. Each is introduced by a small woodcut vignette showing seasonal rural scenes, as you can see, giugno, agosto, and settembre. But agronomic literature that once celebrated the countryside as a place of pleasure and well-being gradually gave way to sparsely illustrated manuals designed for quick reference. These texts offered practical guidance, primarily aimed at boosting productivity and improving crop yields. This is a quotation from one of the authors we have seen previously. He wrote, "There is no income more honest, abundant, secure, and stable than that which is earned through the divine art of agriculture. How blind are those merchants who toil across seas, lands, and forests, risking their lives and fortunes in pursuit of a mere 20 or 30% profit. Why do they not abandon that arduous profession to embrace this one, agriculture, which almost always yields more than 3 times what is invested?" So agriculture was seen as a very profitable work. While agronomic production also addressed certain plants and herbs intended for human and animal consumption, as we have seen, and by extension for trade, Materia Medica reflects a distinct vision of nature, regarded as a repository of substances for the treatment of the suffering human body. First of all, what do we mean for Materia Medica? Materia Medica refers to the body of substances of primarily plant origin, but also of animal and mineral origin, from the Mediterranean basin and the Near East, which were believed to possess medicinal properties. And it is true. These were first systematically described in the work of the physician Dioscorides, originally written in Greek. The work of Dioscorides was translated into Latin under the title of De Materia Medica. By the way, as for plants, many of the medicinal properties recognized since antiquity have been confirmed today through biochemical analysis. However, the majority of studies required to verify or disprove this ancient knowledge have yet to be undertaken. Anyway, between the 15th and the 16th century, with the advent of movable type printing, a rich production of printed herbals flourished alongside an already abundant manuscript production. Dioscorides' text, De Materia Medica, long corrupted and lacking illustrations, was reconstructed, was commented and translated into the vernaculars. Ancient knowledge was reassessed through direct observation, and texts became increasingly illustrated, first schematically, then with greater naturalistic accuracy. Professionals and amateurs alike compiled personal herbals inspired by reading and fieldwork. Their motivation lay less in commerce, less in trade, and much more in the desire to verify ancient learning and pursue new discoveries. about the medicinal virtues of plants. By exploring a famous woodcut map of early modern Venice, a spectacular work documenting the city's layout at the end of the 15th century, we can still see where well-off residents, monasteries and convents, professionals and artisans kept their own gardens to grow medicinal plants. You can find a series of videos on YouTube, if you want to have a look next days, that reconstruct these gardens through archival records and historical images. Among them is the garden of Pietro Antonio Michiel, not a professional botanist, but a civil servant, a Venetian civil servant, who was also a passionate investigator of materia medica. His garden no longer exists, but its content can be reconstructed thanks to a few surviving documents and thanks to his 5 volumes of plant descriptions, accompanied by colored illustrations by a local painter. Here you can see the 5 volumes of Pietro Antonio Michiel's Herbal, which is kept at the Marciana Library. This just to give you an idea of the manuscript Herbal of Pietro Antonio Michiel. On the recto of each folio is the depiction of a plant, while on the verso Michiel himself describes its characteristics, such as its place of origin, seasonality, mode of reproduction, medicinal virtues, opinions about the plant, and so on. His study rendered him a leader among contemporary botanists. He was able to describe over 1,000 plants and to identify as many as 150 new plant species. This is a pen portrait of Pietro Antonio Michiel within his own herbal. A nobleman lacking wealth, rich only in children, as he liked to describe himself, Michiel studied plants in books and by direct observation. He grew as many as he could in his own garden at San Trovaso in Venice to better investigate their morphological characteristics and medicinal or toxic properties. This quotation is from a letter to the famous botanist Ulisse Aldrovandi from Bologna. Here Michiel outlines his work in the garden, his everyday work in the garden, on the manuscript and on the manuscript Herbal, undertaken in collaboration with the painter. I can read just the end. He, the painter, with his brush, and I, Michiel, with my pen, have set them forth in all their likenesses and properties. Thanks to Michiel's contacts with the Spanish and Venetian diplomats living in Spain, Michiel managed to get plants from the Americas that were still little known in Europe. Some he managed to grow in his garden, such as the chili pepper, capsicum, annum, which is painted from life in one of its earliest and most accurate depictions, and the wild tomato, the yellow one, which was considered a toxic plant at the time, and actually it was a wild tomato. From Marcantonio Barbaro, Venetian ambassador in Constantinople, Michiel received an exemplar of the beautiful Martagon lily and the crown imperial. The depiction of the latter was the first to circulate in Western Europe, preceding that of Dodoneus, who first saw the plant in Vienna, actually in 1576. These two images have a peculiar style, and are out of 11 American plants that Michiel could only copy from Mexican originals. The depictions are magnificent, actually populated with lepidopterans, and some of them, not these two, with birds. But some of them are fanciful, to the extent that it is now impossible to identify them botanically. Michiel was the first, anyway, in Europe to study and grow the Diospyros lotus, actually a sort of persimmon apple, a very sweet fruit, a plant native to South Asia. But he did not just grow it in his own garden to observe its evolutionary characteristics. He multiplied it among the gardens of Venetian France and gave it to the Botanical Garden of Padua, from where it spread to the rest of Europe. The animals depicted climbing on the trunk allude to the sweetness of its fruits. But a strong interest in nature was not limited to identifiable figures such as the nobleman Michiel. Anonymous readers also engaged with early printed herbals to recognize and use plants for therapeutical purpose. For instance, this copy of the Hortus Sanitatis is heavily annotated by a mid-16th century hand, possibly that of an apothecary, writing in a mixture of Latin and Italian, interspersed with Venetian dialect. Marginal notes and tested recipes fill the title page, the margins, and 16 densely written pages bound at the end of the volume. On your right, you can see one of these final pages full of recipes, tested recipes. Our anonymous apothecary adds a marginal drawing of the plant, slightly altered, most notably with a trailing rather than upright habit, adapting it to his own experience and supplements its description with observations on the plant's properties not found in the printed text. So, several times readers added descriptions, added plants to the herbal, to the printed herbal they were reading. On a few occasions, the anonymous Venetian apothecary adds plants not found in the Hortus Sanitatis, such as the Lunaria or Pope's money. In the lower margin, he includes a pen drawing and a full description of this herbaceous plant, commonly known as Moneta del Papa or Pope's money. He also adds instructions for medicinal preparations that have an effectum mirabile. It's in Latin. Lunaria annua was absent from both the German printed Hortus and from the Herbarius Latinus printed in Vicenza, this one, which likewise followed the German tradition. Probably this plant was unknown to the German tradition. Here is an intervention of a different anonymous reader on a different printed herbal. This second reader actually limits himself to writing in a clumsy vernacular next to his drawing, which, although slightly native, was naive, was clearly drawn from life. He writes that Lunaria can be found in ditches and marshy places. A third anonymous reader added the same plant to another copy of the Herbarius Latinus, now in Vienna, kept now in the National Library of Vienna around the same period. The annotation in a bastard Gothic script and likely by a German-speaking owner, possibly a physician, suggests a professional engagement with the text. Now, what can we say about these three different cases of addition of plants to the printed herbals? What is striking is that the shared botanical knowledge among these three anonymous readers, despite their different cultural backgrounds, a physician, an apothecary, and a person of very limited literacy, is very impressive. The traces of reading and use in surviving books of Materia Medica is particularly revealing, as together with collections of recipes, they are among the most frequently and heavily annotated genre of all printed works, and thus the most capable of disclosing the modalities of approach to the text and to the book object on the part of the reader. A singular example of this close connection between book of medicinal remedies, book of secrets, so-called, and herbals, may be found in a copy of the Hortus Sanitatis now at Royal College of Physicians in London, whose 16th century reader has glued, in correspondence with some vegetable varieties, cartouche cut from a Swiss edition of the Medicinal Secrets by Alessio Piemontese, a very popular genre. Such amalgamations show a pattern of appropriation of practical medical knowledge in which highly popular works, such as books of secrets and specialized texts, such as printed herbals, were contributing together to the advancement of medical knowledge and practice. And actually, we have now countless copies of printed herbals which have come down to us creased and worn for the heavy use, stained by rain and mud, as they were taken into the field to help identify herbs and plants during foraging excursions. You can see fingerprints, exicata, specimina of exicata, and so on. Some copies are stained with ink, as a fairly widespread practice in the 16th century involved inking leaves, flowers, and branches to press them onto the page for more accurate plant depictions. This was one of the trials. In most cases, printed herbals were used by their owners to assemble personal herbaria, exicata, as evidenced by dried specimina still pinned to the pages or inserted into small labeled slip. As you can see, you can find many of them. These are late survivals of such a kind of dried herbal from the 18th century, early 18th century. Actually, and this is an image giving you an idea of all the multiplicity of texts, printed and manuscripts available during the Renaissance, and with the introduction of printing movable type. With the advent of movable type printing, herbals and books of medicinal remedies became increasingly accessible, encouraging private manuscript production by those who used these works to deepen their knowledge of materia medica. This development supported both domestic health care and practices of professional pharmaceutical people. From the late 16th century, for instance, the Venetian College of Physicians, as well as those in other Italian states, authorized both professionals and lay people to produce remedies of their own invention, provided they proved effective in treating specific ailments. In some cases, Inventors were even granted privileges for their remedies, which over time were absorbed into official pharmaceutical offerings. These handbills advertising officially approved medicinal remedies. These are handbills advertising officially approved medicinal remedies. Actually, in the early modern times, many people from various walks of life were passionate about studying nature and seeking new remedies for ailing bodies. The inventors of medicinal remedies or secrets, and they were not charlatans, but rather passionate investigators of nature who applied their knowledge to develop new treatments, invented many new medical remedies. This is, for instance, a recipe against gout, against sciatic gout, drawn from a privately compiled collection of remedies, now kept at the Marciana Library. The formula is based on pennyroyal, Mentapulegium, minor centaury, Centaurium eritrea, and honeysuckle, Matreselva, likely Lonicera. Recent biomedical research confirms that both Mentapulegium and Lonicera japonica contain significant inhibitors of uric acid production. So, what we can say, that there are still countless secrets waiting to be explored in nature through biochemical analysis, and maybe we should look closer also to the historical sources like those that I've just illustrated to you with a few glimpses. Thank you.